Hello everyone, my name is Henk de Berg. I'm a professor of German at the University of Sheffield and a cultural theorist. I'm here in the University of Sheffield to interview Sir Richard J. Evans. Richard's Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Cambridge. Richard, welcome to the University of Sheffield.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
Your work is far too rich to cover in a single interview. I can't even look at a sort of a smallish bit of it. So I'm just going to focus on one book, which is your book on conspiracy theories. That's this one, the Hitler Conspiracies, the Third Reich and the Paranoid Imagination. But before I do that, I want to ask you another question. You're a well-known public intellectual, you appear regularly on radio and television, but you've also been an expert witness in a number of court cases, most notably the case of David Irving versus Deborah Lipstadt. Deborah Lipstadt, American historian, she called David Irving a Holocaust denier. He then sued her. There was a court case. He lost, she won, and you acted as an expert witness for her. Why did you agree to do that, given the fact that academic discourse is so different from the legal system? So were you not concerned that you might win the historiographical battle, but then lose the legal fight?
Well, first of all, I didn't volunteer myself. I was asked by the defense team for Deborah Lipstadt, in particular by Anthony Julius, who was running the show and had previously earned fame as the solicitor who represented Diana, Princess of Wales, in her divorce suit against Prince Charles, as he then was, and won a record settlement. So Deborah Lipstadt went to Anthony and asked him to represent her. He managed to get Irving to agree that there should not be a jury, and the whole thing would really depend on a single judge and statements by expert witnesses. Now, Anthony said to me over the phone, it won't take you very long, won't be much effort, it'll only be 6 months, and we'll pay you legal rates, standard legal rates for an expert witness. Most of the expert witnesses are pharmacologists who say, you know, the stomach contains so much and this is this poison and the guy is guilty or whatever. So I agreed. And of course, it turned out to take up 3 years of my life, which I don't regret at all, but it was a little bit of a surprise. And it seemed to me to be a very interesting case study in arguments which I had just been dealing with in a book called In Defense of History, which is about truth and falsification in history. And here you have an example of someone who's accused, David Irving, historical writer, of falsifying the record in order to justify his denial of the Holocaust, and sues Deborah Lipstadt for damages because it was undoubtedly damaging to his reputation. He was a freelance author, never been in a university job. And in English law, you have to prove, as it were, prove that you're innocent and not the other side. So Irving didn't have to prove anything about Lipstadt. She had to prove that she did not libel him. And the only way of doing that in this case was to show that what she had said, that he was a Holocaust denier and a falsifier of the historical record, was true. It's called justification, and it's an absolute defense in English law. And so to do that, the defense engaged me, and eventually I needed some research assistance because it was a big job, to go through Irving's works, his books, his speeches, and anything else you could find. It's a process called discovery. So each side has to make available all the relevant evidence to the other side. And this is a civil action. Now, the standards of proof in civil action are not the same as they are in a criminal action. You don't have to prove beyond all reasonable doubt. It's on the balance of probabilities. And that's exactly how we historians work. So somewhat to my surprise, I found that the epistemological strategies of lawyers and historians are really quite similar. And they weren't as different as you might think.
Yeah. Must have been an unnerving experience, though, because I think David Irving conducted his own defense and then interrogated you That must have been some back and forth.
Irving was conducting his own case. In other words, he did not have representation by a professional legal barrister. I think that's probably because he couldn't afford it, or because he couldn't trust a barrister to extract from the case the political capital that he wanted to. He'd been frozen out of the media effectively for the previous few years since he'd become a kind of hardline Holocaust denier. And he wanted to get back really by proving that he was right and proving Lipstadt was wrong. So it had a slightly personal tone about it. I think if you write an expert witness report, as I did, and it was 740 pages long, and took 18 months, 2 years to compile and research, even with help, it was a massive project. But if you do that, the court can't accept what you say, can't regard you at all unless you appear in court to be cross-examined on it by the other side.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened. I was 28 hours altogether, spread over about a week and a half or 2 weeks, in the witness box, being grilled by Irving. I think I rather annoyed Irving by insisting he back up everything he said about my report with chapter and verse. So he would say, you say blah, 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 blah about my work. So can you point me to the page and the line, please? And the judge initially said, oh, come on, Professor Evans, is that necessary? I said, it is necessary because you can't trust Mr. Irving to give an accurate version of what I wrote.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of back and forth. And in the end, he was just calling me witness. He got really shirty, which is very good from my point of view. I think I was pleased about that.
Yeah. Must have been very gratifying and important to win as well, to establish that historical truth.
Well, as I said earlier, it was the appeal of it for me was as a kind of case study in historical truth and falsification. Where does an imaginative interpretation of a document end and a deliberate falsification begin? And we were able to establish these lines, I think, quite well. But by the end of the trial, which was 3 months trial, the sight of elderly Holocaust survivors in the public galleries, and there were so many, we had to move to the largest court in the High Court in the Strand after the first day, and there were long queues around the block and so on. The sight of them was deeply moving. They were, of course, expecting some kind of catharsis, which we couldn't deliver, but they were hoping for the truth to be nailed down, which I think we managed to do. So it had that kind of importance that I didn't really expect at the beginning. And to see Holocaust survivors with their sleeves rolled up and their Auschwitz tattoo number there, sitting next to skinheads with a swastika tattooed on their forehead, was a quite extraordinary experience.
You talked about falsifications. Let's move to one of the most famous or infamous falsifications in history, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Can you first of all maybe briefly outline what kind of text that is?
The so-called Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which actually protocols means minutes, and the Elders of Zion are, in fact, an entirely imaginary group of Jewish elders who are meeting just at the end of the 19th century on the sidelines of a World Zionist Congress. At that time, the Zionists were a tiny fringe group, not really well known even in the Jewish community. This is a pamphlet, quite short, concocted in Russia by an anti-Semite shortly after the turn of the century, probably to justify this particular anti-Semite's instigation of a massacre of Jews, a pogrom in a Russian town. And it purported to be the minutes of a meeting of these elders who were discussing how the Jews rule the world and how they can carry on ruling the world. And so it's all cast in the form of, we do this, we are going to do that. So they're coming from a kind of world Jewish community, which in fact never existed at all, except in the imagination of the writer. So it's quite a bizarre document. It was traced in the 1920s by a number of critics to sources which included a satirical dialogue written by a conservative French writer, a German Gothic novel, and a number of Russian sources as well. So it's a very strange document, and it has some bizarre things in it. For example, at the time it was written, a lot of European cities were building underground railways. And so it said this is all a plot by the Jews to put explosives underneath cities and blow them up in order to control the world. Yeah. There's a lot in it about Freemasonry. Some of that is added a bit later, so that the subheadings of the different minutes are often don't bear a lot of relation to the actual minutes themselves. It's a bit obsessed with sort of obscure financial theories. It's a very strange document. It's kind of turgid and boring, and don't think it had any great influence on its own. What was important and is important about the so-called protocols, which have been translated into many languages and reproduced many times, is the fact they purport to be, and anti-Semites believe that they are, written by the Jews themselves. So it is kind of proof, in inverted commas, that the Jews are controlling the world. They are trying to replace Christianity with Judaism. They're going to abolish monarchies. They're going to have a Jewish dictatorship. All of these kinds of fantastic and really rather silly allegations. It's the fact that they purport to be written by the Jews themselves. So they're constantly cited by anti-Semites, including, for example, in the founding document of Hamas in the Gaza Strip in 1988. They're cited as evidence that Jews want to control everybody, and so they've got to be got rid of. So that's one. Probably not many people have read them from beginning to end. They're not in any way convincing, and there's no way that they're going to rouse a rabble of people to start killing Jews.
Yeah, so we've got the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, I think. That was a real event. And then there are these so-called behind-the-scenes meetings, and the protocols are supposedly the minutes of these secret meetings, but of course the meetings never took place.
That's right.
Therefore no minutes were ever written, and therefore there is no plan for Jewish world domination. Now the interesting thing is, or one of the interesting things about the protocols, of course, Hitler writes a little bit about it in Mein Kampf. It's about this big, and he says something like, because Mein Kampf, of course, 1925, 1926, 2 volumes. So by then it was known that the protocols were a forgery. And Hitler then says something like, well, it doesn't really matter whether they were a forgery or not, because they, so who wrote them and why and when, that is sort of historical quote-unquote detail. What counts is the, in quotation marks, deeper truth that, quote-unquote, the Jews are after world domination. So what Hitler does is that he transposes the notion of truth from the realm of historical fact to that of what we would nowadays call narrative truth, which is untruth, right? It's gut truth, right? It's what an American comedian has called truthiness. It feels right.
Well, it only feels right to extreme anti-Semites. And I wouldn't use the word truth about it in any context at all. It's a complete fantasy.
Yes, I say narrative truth in the sense that it's wrapped up in the story.
I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't use that phrase at all. It's confusing. There's a very interesting conversation during the war recorded in Hitler's propaganda minister's diaries, Goebbels' diaries, private diaries, where they discuss the protocols because Goebbels has been rereading them. And he says he's always been told by his staff they're not usable as propaganda because they're too chaotic, confused, and irrelevant, really. And that's true. The Nazis didn't use them much, though they did they did want schools and school kids to at least be able to look at them. What they could have made of them, I have no idea. So what they say is, well, it may or may not be genuine, but they reveal, in any case, a deeper truth. Yeah. But it's very different from what is in the protocols themselves, because the protocols are neither a racist document. It's pretty clear they're referring to Jewish Judaic religion, and so they're not modern anti-Semitic propaganda like Hitler himself indulged in, and they're not traditional either. So they have traditional anti-Semitic accusations like blood drinking rituals of the Jews, sacrifice of children, Christian children, all of that kind of thing. You find a medieval anti-Semitism. It's really not present in the protocols. What Hitler and Goebbels agree on is that they reveal this kind of inner truth, as they see it, that by their race, by heredity, by the makeup of their racial character, as the Nazis see it, all Jews are subversive of existing institutions, of existing beliefs of Christianity and so on. They're all a kind of subversive, degenerative force.
Yeah. I use the phrase narrative truth, maybe one should say, to put the truth in inverted commas, to try and explain that this kind of works, again in inverted commas, because it is part of an overall story that the Nazis were putting forward. Now, one of the interesting things about this, and you talk about this in your book as well, is that, tell me if I'm wrong, but that many people have maybe overestimated the importance of that particular text within Nazism. Norman Cohn, who wrote one of the earliest books about the text famously, the subtitle of his book is A Warrant for Genocide. The philosopher Hannah Arendt said it's a kind of a Nazi textbook, but do you think that's partly a misconception?
I think it is, yes. It's not a warrant for genocide. The Nazis didn't need a warrant for genocide. They didn't need the Protocols of the Elders of the Sun. They certainly did not get their ideas from the Protocols.
And as you say, some important anti-Semitic elements are not in the text. So
that's right.
Jewish
yes.
Facial, physical characteristics are absent from it. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, it's one of the most bizarre aspects of Nazi ideology, that at one and the same time they claim that Jews are instantly identifiable by some physical characteristics, and also they make Jews identifiable by forcing them to wear the yellow star. So which is it? Can you just tell who's a Jew on the street, or can you not tell and you need to have a special sign?
Now let's turn to another example of a conspiracy theory, the conspiracy theory surrounding Rudolf Hess's flight to the UK in 1941. Can you maybe briefly recall the unfolding of events first? So what exactly is it that Hess did?
Well, let me just preface that by saying there are two main kinds of conspiracy theory. Mm-hmm. This begins with the Protocols of the Elders of the Sun and that kind of conspiracy theory, which is what we call a systemic conspiracy theory. So a large group of people over an enormous area through a lot of time has been pursuing some particular kind of aim in secret. It's illicit, not necessarily criminal, but it's certainly illicit, secret, clandestine, and that's anti-Semitism. And you can see that even in the present day, you can see that there's a common anti-Semitic trope that, for example, Jews control the press everywhere. There's a conspiracy behind what the Jews want. They're conspiring to get the press to say certain things, and that is, there's no evidence of that whatsoever. Apart from anything else, the Jews have always been and still are deeply divided about many, many different issues. There is no kind of uniform aim, purpose, or plot. That's very much like, as I said, Hitler's view that all Jews are racially, as it were, determined, predetermined, even if they don't know it, to be subversive, to control the press, to control the financial markets and so on. So it's a complete fantasy. Then there's another kind, a second kind, which we call event conspiracy theories. That is, say, some kind of event in history is ascribed to the secret machinations of a small group of people. And conspiracy theories, of course, are linked. So an event conspiracy theory may ascribe it to a plot of the Jews, and then it becomes also part of a systemic conspiracy theory. That's not necessarily the case. So events that have been particularly popular with event conspiracy theories include the assassination of US President John F. Kennedy, US landings on the moon, and there have been many. Nowadays, it's almost impossible for something major to happen without conspiracy theorists coming out of the woodwork and saying, no, it's not a chance thing, it's a deliberate plot by somebody or other. So very often these are unexpected events, rather like the assassination of President Kennedy. Nobody really expected that to happen. So in this case, the deputy leader of the Nazi party, Rudolf Hess, who'd been close to Hitler since they were both in prison in 1924 for their part in the so-called beer hall putsch the previous year. He had helped Hitler with his autobiographical political tract, Mein Kampf, My Struggle or My Fight.
Yeah, a lot less so than was originally assumed, I think.
It was initially thought that Hitler had dictated it to, but in fact now we know that Hitler wrote it himself. It's just that Hess edited it, tried to turn it into readable German with only, I'm afraid, rather limited success. Perhaps I should say it's a rather good thing that it wasn't very successful.
Is that still what historians think?
Hess. There's a huge new 2-volume edition of Mein Kampf with massive annotations that's come out. So Hess certainly did, and his wife polished it up after Hitler had written the first draft.
Okay, it's my understanding, on the basis of that 2016 kritische edition, that Hess actually did very little, that it was largely, basically exclusively Hitler, and that maybe Hess picked up on some typos or...
No, he did edit it. I didn't put his own stuff in it. I mean, he tried to make it clearer, which is also the publishers, of course, had to do. It was one of these texts that require a lot of editorial work. And it's my understanding from that edition that Hess and his wife put in quite a bit, and the publisher put in quite a lot as well. But no doubt it's authentic Hitler. Because he was close to Hitler, Hess was very much in his confidence, and he was very active during the Nazi seizure of power. He was a qualified pilot, and he used to sort of buzz open-air meetings of oppositional parties, for example, in the early 1930s, before Hitler came to power. But once he was put in the position of kind of head of the party apparatus and deputy leader, he couldn't really make the transition. He was much more a man of action. And stuck in an office, he gradually lost power. He didn't really quite know what to do. On paper, he had a great deal of power. But this is gradually usurped by people like Martin Bormann, who is his sort of number two, who really did understand power. So
I was very much better at backstabbing and sort of office politics
better
as
at
well.
Office politics, that's right, which was an enormous amount in Nazi Germany. So in 1941, after Hitler had successfully conquered most of Western Europe the previous year, he began planning an invasion of Russia, or more accurately, the Soviet Union, as it was then. It's going to be large Russia. By late 1940, early 1941, Hess realized he was being pushed out of the decision-making process. In fact, his secretary later described him as having sort of, in his office, just pushing pieces of paper around and not really knowing what to do. So he got wind of the fact that Hitler was planning to invade the Soviet Union. And he decided, actually it wasn't wholly crazy, that this would be a rather bad thing, that it would mean Germany was fighting on two fronts, because the British Empire was fighting in the West, had not given up, and under the leadership of Winston Churchill was doing moderately well, but still not going to give in. So Hitler thought he had a long-term aim of conquering large chunks of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine and parts of Eastern Europe in order to get food supplies for Germany, because that had been a major reason for Germany having lost World War I.
Yes.
There's over 500,000 Germans died of malnutrition and associated diseases in World War I. He realized from history it's not a good idea to be fighting on two fronts against major opponents. The enormous British Empire, for example, is not just Britain, it's Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and so on. And on the east, the Soviet Union was a vast assembly of different nations under Stalin's leadership. So Hess thought, right, well, why don't I get back my position of power and influence with Hitler and save Germany by going to Britain and negotiating a separate peace, by making the Brits a peace offer, which would mean they would pull out of the war, leaving Germany to fight against Soviet Russia without distraction of the other side of Europe, as it were. The problem was that he really rather misunderstood the whole situation. As Churchill said, you know, he would ally with anybody, including Stalin, to defeat the Germans.
So Hess boards a plane and flies over to the UK.
He flew to the wrong place as well. He thought the Duke of Hamilton, who was himself, like Hess, a professional qualified pilot, Hamilton actually in his youth had flown over Mount Everest, for example, and he was prominent in an Anglo-German Friendship Society, which is not a front for the Nazis, but Hess thought it was. He was advised by his university teacher, Haushofer, who had these theories. Anyway, so he got out of a plane, he trained, he did practice flights, and then off he went one evening. It was a Messerschmitt, specially prepared with tanks extra tanks to make it go all the way to Scotland. He kept it secret from Hitler, but left his adjutant, his kind of military aide-de-camp, with a letter for Hitler to deliver after he'd taken off, and he went with this sort of peace offer. And in fact, he didn't manage to land. He had to bail out in the end, and the aircraft crashed. But he had the peace offer with him. It was nothing more than Hitler himself said, a very vague offer of to Churchill of, well, we'll let the British Empire in peace, providing you let us have a free hand in Europe. As Churchill said quite rightly, this would just be in the end reducing Britain to a client state. You know, if Hitler conquered the whole of Europe, then Britain would be in an extremely weak position. And in fact, before long, for example, there'd be demands from Hitler to surrender the Jews in Britain for extermination and so on. So it was a non-start. It was a no-hoper.
So that all seems very straightforward. Hitler didn't know, Hess did it, but it was a crazy plan. Churchill realized that it was a crazy plan, and he would think, well, that's it.
Yeah.
What are the conspiracy theories that are surrounding this?
Yes. Of course, it's very surprising. I mean, here's a guy who's actually, in formal terms, the deputy head of the Nazi Party, which is ruling Germany. And here he is flying off to Scotland. So he can't have done it on it. He can't have been that crazy. And there are lots of jokes in Germany about it. I mean, the Nazis are in a terrible position. Were they actually going to admit that Hess was crazy? The number two in Germany has been a madman then for the last 8 years.
Is that why they asked Goebbels, you're the propaganda minister,
yes,
what's ever going to do? And then Goebbels says, well, there are situations where even propaganda can't say.
Absolutely. Goebbels said, just try and keep quiet about it. It'll blow over, people will forget it. There's lots of evidence. The place to start looking for explanations, of course, is not only with Hess, who right to the end of his days, which were very long, he lived over the age of 90, always maintained he'd done it on his own initiative without telling anybody at all about it, apart from the people who prepared the plane. Hess didn't know. Hess insisted on that. Hitler didn't know about it, and you can then, if you look at Hitler, his reactions are described by a number of people who were with him at the time when he opened the letter.
Hitler's reaction.
Yeah, Hitler's reaction when he opened the letter from Hess. He just foamed at the mouth, and I mean, not literally, but sort of bit the carpet. I mean, he had a huge outbreak of rage because he didn't know about it. It was a betrayal. It was such a betrayal that one of his conditions, if he did have a kind of separate peace, or if he with Britain, was that Hess should be, who was imprisoned by this time in Britain, should be handed over for execution. It was a shock, absolute shock. So it's that surprise element. It's difficult to believe that it was kind of a chance occurrence. Hess was simply somewhat deranged, not mad, but he was working under these ridiculous illusions about making a separate peace and getting back into Hitler's good graces. It can't be right. That's too much. One of the things about conspiracy theories is that everything has to be explained in terms of people wanting it to happen.
Yeah.
Chance plays no part in history at all. And explanations which are official, as it were, is the term they tend to use, which means generally agreed among historians, nothing official about them really. They are not credible because they're too, they don't explain anything.
Yeah. Then there's no chance, there are no accidents, there's no human frailty.
Nothing happens by
There's
accident.
no a file that goes missing by mistake, never goes missing by mistake, it must be a plot.
Yeah. So there's plot.
What kind of plot are we then talking about?
Well,
Hitler and Hess planning this together, or what is the conspiracy theory?
Well, conspiracy theories range. There's a whole range of them. One of these theories is that Hitler commissioned Hess to do the flight. Now, the problem with that is, A, there's no evidence. B, why would Hitler have commissioned Hess? Wouldn't he find somebody better than that to go? Couldn't he use diplomatic service or use somebody prominent and so on? But there's no evidence, that's the main thing, absolutely none whatsoever. Another one would be, that I've come across, is that MI5 or MI6, or the British Secret Service, somehow lured Hess over. And again, why? Because he's not particularly prominent, and they know that in Whitehall. They know that Hess has lost power and influence over the previous few years. There are even more bizarre theories, but those are, I think, the main one. There are even stranger ones. There's a plot by Himmler and the SS to discredit Hess, but he was pretty discredited already. And
anyway,
the problem, if you look at, and one of the things I do in my book is try and say, right, this is how conspiracy theories work. Let's apply that to a small number of conspiracy theories involving Hitler and the Nazis. And in this case, you find explanations or pseudo-explanations to why no serious historian has ever accepted that Hess did not fly on his own initiative and on his own. One of those is that witnesses have gone missing mysteriously. They mysteriously disappeared. The Duke of Kent, for example, was killed in a plane crash, so he must have been murdered by people who want to keep it quiet. Why did Hess it was a huge secret. Why did he commit suicide at the very end of his life in Spandau prison? Well, to make sure he kept quiet. But he'd kept quiet. He'd insisted he worked on his own for many decades since the end of the war. Documents must have been suppressed that tell the truth, whereas in fact, there's no evidence that any serious documents have gone missing at all. I mean, the National Archives, which keeps them, makes them freely available to researchers, all the relevant documents. There have even been attempts to forge documents that supposedly prove that Hess flew as a result of a British conspiracy.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
So what conspiracy theorists does, as you say, is they anything that's missing or where you've got 300 witnesses, one gets driven over by a car, and they must have been killed. And then the other thing you point out in your book is they consistently quote each other as proof.
That's right, yes.
So conspiracy theorists, A says this and this has already been proved.
Yes.
But that then turns out to be
another conspiracy theory.
That's right.
That's right. Yes.
But then there's also this case of someone, let's say allegedly, inserting fake documents into the National Archives.
Yes, which resulted, when they were discovered, the National Archives then having a rule that if you're going to take notes, you can't do them on single sheets. You have to have a notebook.
Yeah. The interesting thing about that is that then the defense was by this guy who shall remain nameless. He said, the documents I based my book on, I looked at the originals, but then in order to discredit me, someone removed the originals and put in these cheap forgeries.
Yep.
And that's another thing that you see often with conspiracy theories, right? In order to make one conspiracy theory work, you have to pile another on top of it. So you get a kind of intellectual Ponzi scheme.
There's a kind of infinite regression. But history, again, I think it is a discipline in which you need to apply what medieval scholars called Occam's law. That's to say, you have the most obvious explanation is usually the best one.
Yeah.
Because there's most evidence for it. And there's a kind of fanaticism about conspiracy theorists. So they're not to be deviated, not be pushed aside from their theories because they have this inner conviction that they're right and everybody else, including all the serious historical scholars who've investigated these things in an unbiased way, is wrong.
Yeah. That almost becomes a kind of argument. If this is the establishment theory, it must be wrong for that very reason, because it's the establishment saying it.
Well, it's not, of course. I mean, professional historians are not part of the establishment. We're not told what to do by any government or any official body. We make our own minds up about how we explain the past.
Plus people disagree with each other, historians, all the time.
Goodness, yes.
And that's then the process, at the end of which you then have certain historical facts and things that we know happened and things that we know didn't happen. Now, you've looked at a whole range of conspiracy theories, not just the ones to do with the Nazis. Are there any sort of general conclusions you can draw about conspiracy theories? So you've already distinguished between systemic conspiracy theories and event conspiracy theories. Are there other things you can say about the structure or the constituent elements of conspiracy theories that you see, if not in all, then in most of them?
Well, first of all, it's very much as the judge in the Irving versus Lippstadt case concluded, that conspiracy theorists, and of course Holocaust denial is a massive conspiracy theory, where you have thousands of historians, journalists, investigators, and so on, ever since 1945, have been engaged in some kind of conspiracy to suppress the truth, which is that the Holocaust never happened. That's one of the biggest conspiracy theories of all. And there is this sort of visceral belief in conspiracy theorists that it was, that all the evidence, everything scholars have written is all wrong. And you find this in the Hess affair. There are conspiracy theorists who simply will not accept what historians have written about it on the basis of a careful examination of the evidence. They must be all doing what they're told by some official body, though it's never clear who or why. Who is interested really in any official government position since 1945 about why Hess went or why he went to Scotland. So that's one conclusion, I think. So they bend the evidence in order to suit their prejudices, as the judge concluded. They simply mold it. They try and find alternative explanations. They make things up. They change documents. They invent documents. They invent utterly implausible reasons as to why there is no evidence for their theories. So that's one side of the way they handle the evidence. And I was fascinated to see in the different theories that I looked at that you find this kind of thing coming up again and again. Then, more seriously, I think there's a really disturbed relationship to the truth and how you find out about the truth. There's a belief that the truth is simply a product of political belief. There's no such thing as objectivity, and the whole way in which different people can see the same event from different perspectives is somehow then leads to the quite wrong conclusion that there is no truth. So that, I think, is a really serious threat. And you yourself have written about Donald Trump and the way that he has contempt for truth in a similar way to Hitler, for example. Though they don't have a lot more in common, in my view, but that's certainly one thing they certainly do.
Yeah.
And we live in what some people have called a post-truth society, in which the coming of the internet and social media, which are by and large not regulated, certainly not in the way that communications media were before. There are no gatekeepers like magazine editors or TV producers to push bizarre theories to one side. You can just send it out there. And that is, I think, a real threat, because if you can't find out what the truth is, how can we base any reasonable politics, any reasonable policies and decisions on any kind of evidence at all, if the evidence is all suspect? So I believe very strongly you can distinguish between fake and falsehood and truth and accurate, objective reporting.
So I think from what you're saying, it follows that conspiracy theories are now more widespread than ever before, and they spread much more quickly. Is that right?
That's right, yes. And every time you get a change in the technology of communication, you get a kind of spike in conspiracy theories, whether it's the invention of printing in the 15th, 16th centuries, or whether it's television and radio, or whether it's film, and then now it's the internet.
Yeah.
Almost as soon as any event occurs, you'll find the conspiracy theorists putting it out there and saying, no, this is really not true, it didn't happen this way, it happened that way. The landings on the moon were all happened in a Hollywood studio, although we know that the technology to fake TV visual reporting did not exist at that time, whereas the technology to land on the moon certainly did. It was a very dangerous operation, but it could be done. One example is, for example, that what's known as 7/7, simultaneous attacks on the tube and the bus and so on in central London a few years ago, in 2007, were faked by the Blair government in order to get more power for the police. The dead bodies, the people killed with blood, were really just actors with tomato ketchup, and it was all fake. But in fact, the the hospitals, medical practitioners, the news media, the police, everybody piled up evidence that was so overwhelmingly convincing that it actually was real and did happen, that the conspiracy theorists were effectively silenced.
Do you think that the fact that we now have so many more fictional stories and films about or putting forward conspiracy theories, that has had an impact as well, be it Oliver Stone's film about JFK, or even this film, what's it called, Capricorn 1, where NASA fakes, I think, a Mars landing in a TV studio, and people watch all these things. Does that, all these films, does that make them more skeptical of what historians say? That people are now much more exposed to these conspiracy theories in the form of fiction, but then they don't see them as fiction.
I think we must give people more credit than you're doing. I think people can tell the truth from fiction. It's just fun to think, what about alternative explanations for the Kennedy assassination. What really made the difference, if you look at the opinion polls, do people accept the Warren Report, which concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald carried out the assassination on his own after massive investigation? What made the difference to people's views was Watergate. Now, Watergate is famous for having, among many other things, given rise to what's called the Mitchell effect. So Martha Mitchell, wife of the Attorney General, was asked by somebody and said, oh look, this break-in at the Watergate Hotel during an election campaign in order to plant bugs and so on to try and President Nixon and the Republicans wanted to find out what the Democrats are doing, and that's where they were staying in the Watergate Hotel. How do you explain it? And she said, it must have been concocted in the Oval Office, in the White House. It's Nixon who's doing that. Yeah, get away with it. Of course he didn't, And that's just a conspiracy theory. And she turned out to be right. So there are some conspiracies that do happen, that are real, some theories that are right. And I think that destroyed a lot of the confidence in in official. In this case, it really was an official report, the Warren report, and you find in opinion polls in the USA, belief in conspiracy theories of one kind or another begins to take off, not with the arrival of the internet, but it's with the Watergate conspiracy.
So, and some of this stuff, of course, is more innocuous than other stuff, right? Speculating whether it was just Lee Harvey Oswald or maybe the KGB, the FBI, Fidel Castro, and so on. Okay, not great, but that's one thing. But if you believe that an election wasn't done properly,
as most Republicans do,
that will have a massive impact on people's understanding of politics.
Absolutely, I see. But even supposedly, apparently innocuous conspiracy theories, like the moon landings having taken place supposedly in a Hollywood studio, those are dangerous as well because they subvert our willingness to accept objective scientific truth. And that has real direct consequences. For example, if you believe that the MMR, measles, mumps, rubella vaccine produces autism, as was put forward by a kind of rogue doctor a few years ago, one of the results of that has been that people were much more reluctant to have their children inoculated against measles, and so as you have an outbreak of measles, which can be, and in some instances is, a deadly, fatal disease. And medical conspiracy theories, of course, about COVID, particularly anti-vaccine theories, it's all a conspiracy by Bill Gates, for example, to implant some kind of viral device in people so that he can press a button and they'll all become automata and switched on and he'll be able to tell them what to do. The most fantastic and ridiculous, absurd conspiracy theories that they had quite a bit of traction, and that can also be dangerous too.
Yeah. Final question, is there anything we can do about this?
Yes, I mean, there's no magic switch, there's no silver bullet, but I think we have to keep on insisting on the truth, that there is something as a truth, and if you're careful enough and thorough enough, you can establish it and discredit attempts to deny it.
Okay. Richard, thank you very much for doing this
interview.
interview.
Thank you for your question.